Bonjour, Nakanstuk, Nzinagijik, and Dijinakas. In my language, I greet you and I extend greetings to the people of this territory, and I thank the elders for the welcome that has been shown to me and to others here this evening, and I thank the elders of the tribes whose traditional territory this is for having allowed us to be here this evening on your territory. I also want to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation to be here with you and the very warm welcome that you've all extended to me to spend this time with you and talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is the future of our country, future of our relationship. I wanted to also take this moment to acknowledge all of the work that you have done. It's a very impressive presentation that you've shown, but all of the activities that you've been engaged in for the past 20 years, and I congratulate you on all of your accomplishments as well. But you all know, of course, that the things that we have accomplished in the past are just the foundation for what we need to do for the future. So you have a very strong foundation, but you still have a lot of work to do, as we all do. This evening, I also want to just express my gratitude to my family for allowing me to be here. It was a little hectic time for us this week because my daughter from Vancouver came to visit us for the weekend and ended up in the hospital. And so we spent the better part of 72 hours in the hospital while she underwent surgery to remove her gallbladder and then fought some infections and other problems and complications that arose. And so after 72 hours of sitting very closely together in a very small waiting room in the hospital, they all said to me, "Get out of town." And I said that I would acknowledge them to all of you because they're gathered again this evening at the events relating to the hearings of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, which are going on in Winnipeg this week. And they have spent many hours there with the survivors and the families of the missing and murdered to help show their support, not only by being there, but also by interacting with them, because we are a very traditional family and we participate in those things and take them very seriously. My wife called me just as I was leaving the hotel to come here this afternoon to remind me that when I left home at 5:30 this morning, I failed to wake her up to say goodbye and to tell her that I loved her, which is something she said, "You always do that. Why didn't you do that this morning?" And I said, "Well, I didn't really want to wake you at 5:30 in the morning because I've had experience doing that in the past." You see, I'm a fish clan in our tribe. It's a tradition of acknowledging people who are the philosophers and the seers and the ones who talk about the visions of the people. And so we are acknowledged as being the dispute resolvers as well in our lodge. She's a bear clan. And the fact that I'm a fish and she's a bear sort of gives you an indication of what the nature of our relationship. She tends to poo-poo all of those teachings and say the fish only exists to feed the bear. About 20 years ago, shortly after the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry report was released, of which I was one of the commissioners, I was named by the Winnipeg newspaper, local Winnipeg newspaper, as one of the 100 most important people in Manitoba. In fact, they had me listed as the 7th most important person in Manitoba. And I get up early, as I tell you, and as I told you before, and so about 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm reading the newspaper and I see this, and I was very excited by it, and I wanted to tell her. But I knew enough to wait. So I told the dogs all about it and shared the story with them, and they didn't have Facebook and Twitter as much as they do now, so I didn't have any other resource to go to. So after waiting patiently not so patiently, after waiting for an hour, I finally got up the nerve and I went in and I woke her up, and she looked at me with one eye and said, "What?" And I said, "Here, read this." She said, "Where's my coffee?" And I said, "Just wait, I'll go get it, but just read that." And so I went and got her coffee and came back, and she had rolled over and wrapped herself in the blanket, and I said, "Well, did you read it?" And she said, "Yeah, I read it." I said, "So what do you think?" She said, 7. And they didn't even mention me. And she said, "You're not even the 7th most important person in this house." So that's why I failed to wake her up this morning at 5:30 to tell her that I was leaving the house to go catch a plane, and that I loved her. And so I wanted to acknowledge her as well, because you may or may not remember, some of you came up and acknowledged that you recalled a couple of years ago, she and a group of other women organized a walk around Lake Winnipeg. And she organized this walk in a relatively short period of time, and they succeeded in walking a total of 1,200 kilometers in a period of about 26 days. And it was all done by women, organized by women, because in our teachings, the women are the keepers of the water and the teachers of the water teachings and the keepers of the water songs. And so she did that, and they did ceremony all along, and they invited people from the communities to join them. And they started off, there was only 4 of them who started the walk together. They were quickly joined by 8 others from the community, and by the time they finished, there were 150 of them walking into the community of Manigataugan, acknowledging the water and what was happening to Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is gone from one of the most beautiful, pristine lakes in the world to the point now where you can't even swim in it. It's so dangerous to children and to adults. So our hope is that it will come back to life with efforts like that. And she continues that work, and I want to acknowledge her and our daughters and our granddaughters for helping her in that as well. So thank you for allowing me to be here to share that story with you. Now, I have a PowerPoint presentation. Actually, I'm going to leave with the organizers, and they can share it with whoever wants to have it. But technology has said that it's either you get to look at me or you get to look at the slides. And of course, I'm so vain, I want you to look at me. But it was difficult to switch back and forth, so we flipped a coin and you lost, so you have to look at me now. And the slides will be made available to you by the organizers when this is finished here this evening. But the question I think that I wanted to talk to you about was the issue of reconciliation. You'll see from the title of my presentation was getting to the truth was hard, getting to reconciliation is going to be harder. And I want to tell you why. I want to talk about what it is that we're facing and why things seem to be moving so slowly. Despite all of the wonderful things that are happening in the communities, there are still there is still a growing sense of frustration that things are not happening quick enough. And that is so despite the warning that we gave at the final event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we need to understand that it took us 150 years to get to this point in the relationship from Confederation. It took us that long to create this relationship that we have between Indigenous people and the government, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. That 7 generations of people have gone through residential schools. We need to understand that it's going to take us a long period of time to fix this. And we need to not just be patient, we need to be tolerant of the fact that from time to time we will stumble as we try to find our way. And at the time we issued our report in 2015, we knew that the government of the day, the federal government of the day, was not interested whatsoever in what we had to say about changing the relationship. And I said that publicly at the time, and I'll say it again tonight. We did not write this report for governments. We wrote this report for people like you. We wanted you to have the tools. We wanted you to have the knowledge. We wanted you to have the inspiration, and we wanted you to feel the commitment to change that was needed in this country. And I congratulate all of you here and those other thousands of people around the country who have taken up that challenge, because they have seen it. And a movement has been created, and things are happening. So let us never give in to despair around the issue of reconciliation. Let us recognize that we do have a lot of work to do, but that things are happening, and we will continue to make things happening so long as we understand what it is that we still face and need to fix. But the real question is, what kind of relationship do we want, which gets to the question of what does reconciliation mean? Reconciliation is a tough term to define. We kind of all have an instinctive feeling for the word, but it's often different from group to group and person to person. There are some who think reconciliation is all about forgiveness, that you have to forgive the perpetrator in order to reconcile. You have to start loving each other all over again. And some of that comes from the work of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which talked about forgiveness. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in his writings, talked about the importance of forgiveness for the victims of apartheid in order to be able to move forward. And certainly from an individual perspective, in order to be able to come to some sense of healing and some sense of strength, there is a need to forgive somebody. I think it may be more important to forgive yourself for the victimization that you have gone through and what you have done with that and how that has affected you. But there is space for forgiveness in the conversation, but it's up to each victim of that experience to figure out where forgiveness fits into the dialogue. But it makes no sense to suggest that we have to forgive the churches or we have to forgive the government any more than it does for a victim of a road accident to say that you have to forgive the car that ran you down, because you can't. The car is not a being. It's the driver that you have to think about, and can you forgive the driver? And we also have to come to terms with the realization that there are some things that are simply not forgivable, and therefore we should not be stuck on that term. The reconciliation, though, does have meaning in the context of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and that is about correcting the relationship, about establishing the kind of relationship that we should have, recognizing all of the things about history that have occurred, including the bad, but starting with the good, and understanding what it was that was intended when the relationship first started, when contact first occurred. What were we thinking as Indigenous people? What were they thinking as explorers and settlers and colonizers? We know a large part of that side of the discussion, but we don't know a lot about the side of the Indigenous recipient. And I tell teachers, when I talk to teachers, I said, you're still teaching our Canadian history from the perspective of Europeans, whether you know it or not, or whether you're prepared to accept it or not, because you can tell your students who those first Europeans were who came to this land by name, but you cannot name the people they met. And why not? With some effort, you can find out. You can find out who they are. And with some effort, you can find out what they might have been thinking and what they might have been doing at the time. If we can find out what the people of the Bronze Age from thousands of years ago were thinking when they were inventing the tools at that time, why the hell can't we find out what people only 500 years ago were finding out about each other? It's not that difficult, but it does take effort, and we haven't yet put in that effort. As I said, we have some work to do yet. But the relationship, that's what's important. Establishing a proper relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And what is that relationship going to be like? Well, it's going to be different from place to place, from people to people, from territory to territory. But every relationship, in order to be successful, requires one thing, at least, and that is respect, mutual respect. There has to be respect on each side for the other. If you do not have respect for the person in the relationship with you, then you will not have a proper relationship. Then it will be a relationship of dominance. It will be a relationship of imbalance. It will be a relationship of one taking advantage of the other. And that's what has been going on for far too long, particularly since Confederation. We also need to think about relationship between people, between individuals, and relationship between peoples, and that is between nations, between entities of people, between groups of people. When we talk about relationships, we need to talk about what we have to do to improve the relationship between people who live in the same neighborhood or who work together or go to school together. So we have to address the issue of racism on a person-to-person basis, and knowledge and education are tools in that area. But we also have to talk about what are the institutional changes we need to do in order to ensure that the tribal entities and the governmental entities of this country can have a proper relationship. And that requires a different kind of an analysis, a different kind of thought process, and a different way of working. But they are both important. Relationship between people and relationship between peoples. If we look historically at the kind of relationship that Indigenous people had with non-Indigenous people historically, we know that self-reliance by Indigenous people was the norm up till Confederation. Historians who look at the situation know that even despite the impact of the fur trade was used by Indigenous people as much as by non-Indigenous people for their own positioning within the hierarchy of nations within this land. But that doesn't mean that we became quickly dependent and in need of it. It just meant that we took advantage of it. So self-reliance by Indigenous people was the early part of what it was that the explorers encountered, and that relationship or that aspect of Indigenous behavior continued throughout most of our history. But again, Confederation changed everything, and we have to talk about what impact that had. So before that, we could see mutual dependence and support on the part of Indigenous, non-Indigenous people was part of that relationship. And it's reflected in a document which legal people know about, and many historians, of course, talk about, and maybe some of you have heard about, called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. which followed on the war between England and France, which was a world war of classic proportions all across the world. England and France were fighting for territory, and they settled the claim in North America by acknowledging that England would be the sovereign power in North America after the French and English War. But England was in a state where it couldn't continue to fight anymore. And so they issued a proclamation in 1763 in which they gave assurances to all of the, what they called Indian tribes and Indian nations of this territory, promising them that if they did not take up arms against the English crown, that they would be entitled to maintain their lands and they would be entitled to maintain their own way of doing things, and that the crown would not interfere with that. And that became part of the relationship because in 1764, a representative of the British Crown called all of the Indigenous leaders together, sent out runners and messengers, and asked all of the Indigenous leaders to meet with him in Fort Niagara. And he had the Royal Proclamation translated so that they were able to understand what the words were and what the words meant and what the assurances were. And they each signed or acknowledged in a document that they understood that and they accepted the terms. Over 3,800 leaders from all over North America, including British Columbia, attended that gathering over the course of that year in 1764. And it came to be known as the Treaty of Niagara. And that Treaty of Niagara became the means by which the Royal Proclamation became part of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The self-assurance that Indigenous people needed to hear, that they would be protected, that they would not be interfered with in their lands, were an important part of that feature. Which is why when you look at the post-Confederation treaties, you do not see those kinds of promises in them. Because by tradition, by oral history, Indigenous leaders had already been told that that was going to be the case. And so it didn't need to be in the post-Confederation treaties. We see that in some of the treaty negotiations, particularly the early negotiations in the Robinson-Huron treaties, where they said, we remember when you promised us that you would not interfere with the way we did our business. But all you're asking for is permission to set up your villages in our land, and we give you that. So those assurances that are contained in those treaties from 1850 on didn't need to say, we promise you self-government, we promise you self-determination, we promise that we won't interfere with your children, because that had already been given, that had already been agreed to. But Confederation changed everything. And so the question is, what kind of relationship do we now have? Colonization and domination since Confederation has been the hallmark of Canadian activity. Unilateralism is what the government of Canada followed from that period on, imposing poverty on Indigenous people by the taking of lands, by the sheer taking of lands, even though legally, and it's still part of the law of this country, all of the land in Western Canada belongs to the Indigenous people until the government, until the Crown, through the government, negotiates surrenders of the land. It's in the British North America Act of 1870. And that promise that the government of Canada made to the British Crown in return for sovereignty in the West has not yet been met. And that will still be the subject of litigation going forward. But the taking of lands was what the relationship after Confederation was all about. And that meant removing Indigenous people from the land and removing their connection to the land from them. And we see the impact of all of that. I'm going to show you a video at the end of the presentation which makes it very clear what it is that we're dealing with today. But we see the high incarceration rates for Indigenous people these days, the highest incarceration rates anywhere in the world of any identifiable racial group are here in Canada. And in Canada, we also have the highest rate of Indigenous child welfare apprehensions. Children from Indigenous families represent almost 50% of all children in care in Canada today, 10 times their presence in the population. And the reasons for those takings often have very little to do with abuse, but have everything to do with economics, with poverty, with anticipated negligence. And more needs to be done to address that. We see health problems on the part of Indigenous people that exist nowhere else in Canada. Tuberculosis is now returning in Indigenous communities, and other diseases that are being well addressed in many places throughout the country are not being addressed in Indigenous communities. The housing needs of Indigenous people in their communities are not being met. Water supplies are poorly provided, and in some cases, Indigenous people can't drink the water. They have to have it shipped in or sent in by bottles. And the education that Indigenous people receive in their own communities, even with Indian Band education authorities, are still lower than the educational standards for the rest of the society because funding provided to those school boards is below the funding levels that the federal government itself pays provincial school boards to educate those very same children if they leave the reserve and go to a school in town. It has led tremendously to a loss of Indigenous self-respect on the part of young people. Before you can have mutual respect, Indigenous people have to have self-respect. They have to have a sense of pride. And I've often talked about the fact that you cannot expect the conversation to be between equals when one party to the conversation believes that you believe that we are not your equal. That conversation is not going to go very far. And there is a very clear lack of respect by many in the non-Indigenous community for Indigenous people. And that lack of mutual respect will have a contribution to continuing loss of mutual respect, to the point where young Indigenous people, through their own activism, will become disenchanted with the efforts that they will be displaying. And it may lead to other kinds of actions, more militant than we are seeing today. And the thing that all of this history that has occurred since Confederation has also contributed to is individual racism. People have been educated to believe that Indigenous people are inferior in our public schools, never mind our Indigenous schools. We know what happens in the residential schools. Kids in the residential schools were told from the moment they arrived that they were inferior. Their languages could not be spoken, their cultures could not be practiced because they were pagans and heathens and barbarians and savages. But in public schools, the same message was also being sent, a little more subtly, because in public schools, the only thing we were taught in history was about the arrival of the colonizer, the arrival of those nations from other parts of the world and what they brought. And in fact, when I was in public school, and mind you, that goes back to the 50s and 60s, but when I was in public schools, we were taught that European colonizers saved us from extinction, that we were lucky that they came here and fed us and saved us from freezing to death, because without them, we would have all died off. And growing up with that kind of message does something to the Indigenous child in the public school. But it also does something to the non-Indigenous child, because racism is not always about hate. Racism is also about the presumption of superiority and the assumption of supremacy. If you grow up believing that your people are better than my people, then you will become a racist. Because you will believe, no matter how kindly you want to treat me, no matter how benevolent you are towards me, you will believe that you are doing something good because you are helping someone who needs that help. I was the valedictorian of my graduating class in high school. I was Athlete of the Year. I got top marks in our school. There's only 2 other students that got better marks than I did in my graduating class of 160 students. And yet, when I went back to the 20th anniversary of our graduation, and I was asked to speak, I pointed out to them that there was nobody in the class that I graduated with who would have traded places with me. Because I was poor, I came from the wrong part of town, I didn't have friends on their side of town, and it did not look like I had the same kind of potential for the future as they had. They were guaranteed that they could go to university. They were guaranteed that they could go and work in their dad's business or somebody's business, their dad's friend's business. They were guaranteed success simply by putting their minds to going to take a course. They could be guaranteed of that. I couldn't be. I wasn't. And so they would never have traded places with me. And as a result, I've not been invited back to any of the other anniversaries. So the question really is, how did we get here, I think? And I've talked a bit about that. Racist beliefs that were part of the original contact, the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a papal doctrine issued to colonizing nations to say that Indigenous people were not really human beings. In fact, Christopher Columbus, it is estimated, murdered at least 19 million Indigenous people after his arrival, within the first 10 years of his arrival in Middle America. 19 million people were murdered. The estimates down there by the Indigenous populations are that closer to 90 million people were murdered by Columbus and his conquistadors. But even if you accept the lower number, or even if you accept half of the lower number, 10 million, that's a huge genocide that was being practiced. In a book that I first read about through the work of my friend Thomas Berger, by Bartolomé de las Casas, when he talks about what it was that the conquistadors were doing to the Indigenous people in the Americas at that time, it was savagery on a massive scale. And it was tolerated, and in fact, some could say it might even have been encouraged by those within the church. And there was a debate that went on in the church on a very simple question. Were Indigenous people human beings or not? Imagine that. Having yourself the subject of a debate as to whether you are a human being or not. And until the 1520s, when it was finally determined that we were a lesser form of human being, that question was open for debate, open for interpretation by those who were coming, who committed those crimes. So the early relationship was marked by that kind of attitude. And they went on to follow the thoughts that necessarily arise from that kind of a belief. And that includes things like the treaty-making process. It continued right throughout our history, right up until the treaty-making process. Thomas King, in his book, The Inconvenient Indian, quotes an interesting story. And I asked Thomas one time how accurate he felt this story was, and he said he was pretty sure that it was accurate, but of course it occurred at a time in the 1880s when people who were part of this conference where it was spoken were no longer alive. But he said this, and this is from the book Inconvenient Indian. Let me read this to you. At the Lake Mohonk Conference in October of 1886, one of the participants, Charles Cornelius Coffin Painter, who served as a lobbyist for the Indian Rights Association, pointed out the obvious, that the treaties made with Native people had been little more than expediencies. In his talk, Painter quoted General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had said that treaties, quote, were never made to be kept, but to serve a present purpose, to settle a present difficulty in the easiest manner possible, to acquire a desired good with the least possible compensation, and then to be disregarded as soon as that purpose was attained, and we were strong enough to enforce a new and more profitable arrangement. King goes on to point out that this was the same General Sherman who philosophized that the more Indians we kill this year, the fewer we're going to have to kill next year. So that was the attitude towards treaties in the 1880s in the United States. And that attitude actually is reflected in some of the actions that were going on in Canada around the same time, because Canada essentially waged war against Indigenous people through the use of law, not through military exercises, because militarily there was a question as to whether they'd be able to succeed given the population differences. But through the use of law, they were guaranteed success because they controlled everything to do with law from the time of Confederation. So at the time that they were signing treaties, for example, in which they were promising to build schools on the reserve, they were also passing legislation which required Indigenous parents to send their children to residential schools. So in the very law that they passed, they were doing contrary what they had promised in the treaties. In 1883, in Parliament, this quote is in Hansard: "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write." And that quote is Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, House of Commons, May 14th, 1883. And he was the first Minister of Indian Affairs in Canada's history, because he wanted to control the issue of expansion into the West. In 1920, of course, we all know, I think Duncan Campbell Scott said this: "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." And that is the whole object of this bill when he was talking about amendments to the Indian Act in 1920. When you look at the United Nations Convention on Genocide, Article 2 says, "In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such." And it includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. My comment in the presentation on the closing day of the TRC was that if the government of Canada tried today to do what they did before 1950, they would be guilty of genocide, because that clearly falls within the definition of genocide. And the fact that the Convention on Genocide was passed in 1949 and has some complications about its implementation. In other words, it has to be adopted by the hosting country, which Canada did finally in 1976, once the Indian residential schools had been closed down, let me point out. Then the convention didn't apply to all of its prior behavior, so it couldn't be accused of genocide legally. But the real question, I think, is not what kind of relationship we have. I know all of you have read the 6,428 pages of the TRC report, and that includes, incidentally, about 1,130 pictures. So you have become quite familiar with its contents. But the real question, I think, is what kind of relationship do we want? Now, Canada, and I'm talking about the government of Canada and some elements of our society, when they are prepared to undertake a process of reconciliation, appear to want a relationship of equality, of justice, of peace and friendship, with better programs and better services, a recognition of Indigenous rights so long as they are compatible with Canadian rights and Canadian laws, addressing racism on an individual basis and discriminatory practices within Canadian society, and undertaking to educate all Canadians about this history. There is a feeling among some others in Canadian society that Indian residential schools were in fact a good idea that went badly because of individuals, and that Indigenous people still should be assimilated. Others resent Indigenous people making costly demands for the recognition of their rights. One of my colleagues is quoted as saying, "You can have your rights, but not on my dime." And my response to her was, if we said that to your ancestors when you arrived here, you wouldn't be here now, because we wouldn't give you the dime. Indigenous people, on the other hand, when they talk about reconciliation in the conversations that I've had and that I've heard, want immediate needs addressed, so all of the social problems that have been created through the past need to be addressed and taken care of. But they want to do it in accordance with their own customs, their own practices, their traditions, and their own institutions. Thank you. I knew you'd be a savior. Ultimately, I'll try to hang on to it and not spill it on this nice computer. Whose computer do I have here? Is it? Oh, never mind, I don't really want to know. Ultimately, Indigenous people are looking for recognition of their right to self-government, their right to self-determination, and they want that right, or those rights, entrenched in law beyond the reach of the federal government and provincial governments. And they also want the resources that are necessary to implement that right for ongoing existence to be shared from the resources of this country, just like the provinces and the federal government share in those resources. So obviously there's a very clear disparity at present in the conversation between the Indigenous side and the non-Indigenous side about reconciliation and about where we need to go with it. And I can tell you this much, so long as reconciliation is occurring, or conversations about reconciliation are occurring where one side sees it as a question of rights and the other side sees it as an act of benevolence, reconciliation will not be achieved. We have to overcome that. Reconciliation is going to take understanding, commitment, leadership, and planning, and very clear understanding, commitment, leadership, and planning. And the things that are currently standing in the way of reconciliation in this country are understanding, commitment, leadership, and planning. We had spent a long time as a commission looking at the whole question of the relationship, and we developed 94 calls to action. When you consider the length of the report and the amount of time that we spent, having only 94 recommendations, I thought was an amazing feat. And in fact, I said when we started off, we should actually write a report in which we make no recommendations, in which people will read the report and will come to their own conclusions about what is the right thing to do. We didn't quite get there, so that's a failure on my part. But on the other hand, together those calls to action constitute a plan for reconciliation, and that's how we talked about them. But there's going to have to be a need and a willingness to change the way that we do things. And that's true for Indigenous people as well as for non-Indigenous society, because we see things happening within Indigenous communities and within Indigenous populations that show the impact and the legacy of this period of colonialism since Confederation that is working negatively within Indigenous communities. We see people who are looking to the government for solutions to problems that they should be trying to solve themselves. And to a certain extent, that's necessary. But to look at it every single time and to fail to do anything about the problem when the government fails to act is giving in to the legacy, is to perpetuate the legacy. So it's going to take time, and it's going to take change, and it's going to cost us money. There would be no question of that. But the cost of doing nothing or of continuing to do the same thing is going to be even greater. We have to recognize that we have failed, and in fact, we have created this mess because of what we have tried in this country to this point. And we need now to move on from that, both in terms of leaving it behind, but also in terms of changing the way that we do business, changing the way that we do things. And I read this quote one time. It's attributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know if that's true or not. I've read a lot about Albert Einstein, and maybe he said this, maybe he didn't, but whether he said it or not, it doesn't matter because it's a great quote. Insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And if we continue to do the same thing with Indigenous people and with the government of this country over and over and over again as we have in the past and expect the same results, we will not achieve reconciliation. And now I'm going to cue the video because I want you to take a look at a situation that was recorded about 30 years ago almost now, and ask yourself this question: have we really moved that far from this? When I think that maybe we have accomplished a lot, when I think that maybe we are well along the road to reconciliation, I watch that video and I ask myself, really, how far along have we come? There are still young people who are living on the streets. There are still young people who are lost in that way. There are still young people who are looking for their identity. And there are still young people who give up. And we cannot afford to lose them anymore. So I ask you to do what you can for them. Continue to do the good work that you're doing. Continue to help those who want to take up this struggle as well, because there are no easy solutions. There's only hard work. But it begins with each and every one of us. Reconciliation is not a spectator sport. We all have to play. Thank you.